The dead woman's voice began speaking before Ada Whitaker had finished serving the coffee. At first, no one in the dining room of the Vale house understood what they were hearing. The phonograph horn gave a dry hiss, followed by 3 wavering notes of a lullaby. Then a woman said, very clearly, that the song was for her little sparrow, Ada, who must never believe she had been forgotten. A coffee cup slipped from Ada's hand and broke against the carpet. At the head of the table, Aunt Augusta went white. 22 years had passed since Ada had heard that lullaby. She had been 13 then, young enough for adults to dismiss her memory as childish and old enough to remember her mother's hand being pulled from hers. Every guest at her daughter's engagement supper turned toward her. The voice inside the brass horn continued, weakened by age but still warm. It said that another spring would come, and that when it did, the two of them would see the river together. Augusta rose so abruptly that her chair struck the wall. She crossed the room, seized the brown wax cylinder from the machine, and dropped it onto the hearth. It split into 3 pieces. No one moved. Even the gas flames seemed to draw themselves smaller. Then Augusta looked at Ada and said the one thing she had forbidden anyone else to say for more than 2 decades. "Your mother is dead." Until that moment, Ada had not known whether Marian Vale was alive or dead. She had not known where she had gone, why she had left, or why every question about her had been treated as evidence of bad character. She had been taught only that Marian had chosen the stage, strange men, and applause over her own child. But the voice on the cylinder had not sounded like a woman leaving. It had sounded like a woman trying to be heard through a locked door. The Vale house stood 2 blocks from the courthouse in Bellwether, Ohio, a town that liked to call itself a city whenever the newspaper wrote about its paved streets, its new electric lamps, or the limestone bank rising on Main Street. Traveling salesmen called it a hotel. Local people still called it Mrs. Vale's boarding house, though Augusta had removed the weekly rates from the front window years before and replaced the plain curtains with lace imported from Cincinnati. Respectability mattered to her more than comfort, and appearances mattered more than either. She had bought the building as a widow in 1884, when Bellwether still smelled of mud, horses, and the natural gas wells burning outside town. By 1908, the Vale house had a tiled entrance, a telephone in the office, a velvet settee no one was allowed to sit on, and a dining room famous for Sunday chicken and apple dumplings. It also had Ada. Ada ordered the meat, kept the rooms filled, remembered which salesman disliked feathers in his pillow, and knew how much coal could be spared before a guest complained. She made the preserves, trained the girls, wrote the menus, and sat up with sick boarders when the doctor could not come. Augusta owned the deed and accepted the compliments. Ada did the rest. At 35, Ada had the calm face of a woman whom people trusted with keys, money, fevers, and grief. Her brown hair had begun to silver at the temples. Her hands were broad and capable, with a pale burn mark on the left wrist from an overturned kettle when she was young. Her husband, Daniel Whitaker, had been dead 3 years. He had been a decent man, a clerk at the farm implement works, gentle in speech and careful with his shoes. Augusta had approved of him because his father belonged to the Masons and his mother had never appeared in public without gloves. Ada had not been unhappy with Daniel. That was the phrase she used when she thought of their marriage. He had never struck her, never shamed her, never spent the rent money, and never objected when Augusta summoned Ada back to the Vale house to mend a curtain or settle a quarrel. But he had also never asked what Ada wanted when Augusta was in the room. Their daughter, Elsie, had inherited Daniel's fair hair and Ada's steady gray eyes. She was 17 that summer, quick with figures, impatient with foolishness, and very nearly engaged to Charles Pike, whose father owned the new bank. The supper had been arranged to make very nearly into formally. Augusta chose the china with the gold rim. She placed white roses in the center of the table and seated Charles beside Elsie, though Elsie had asked to sit near the open window. Mr. and Mrs. Pike arrived at 7. Charles arrived 6 minutes later, carrying a narrow velvet case that contained a pearl bar pin. Tom Bader came through the service entrance at 7:30 with a phonograph under one arm. Tom repaired sewing machines, watches, and talking machines in a small shop near the freight depot. He had known Elsie since school and had been invited, against Augusta's wishes, to provide music after supper. Ada suspected that Elsie had arranged it. She also suspected that Augusta knew. Tom's father had come from Württemberg with nothing but a tool roll and a hymn book. That alone made him unsuitable in Augusta's view. His hands bore machine oil under the nails, his coat shone at the elbows, and he listened to Elsie as if her thoughts deserved room. Charles Pike listened differently. He waited for her to stop so that he could improve what she had said. The phonograph was meant to play a comic song and a Sousa march. Tom had purchased a crate of old cylinders from the estate of Tobias Greeley, who had once demonstrated talking machines at county fairs. Most were labeled in fading pencil. One had no title, only a small crescent pressed into the wax near the rim. That was the cylinder Tom placed on the mandrel. That was the cylinder Augusta broke. For several seconds after the pieces struck the hearth, the only sound in the dining room was the turning mechanism of the empty machine. Mrs. Pike touched the cameo at her throat. Mr. Pike studied the broken cup on the carpet. Charles looked not at Ada, but at Elsie, as if deciding how much damage a dead grandmother might do to a proposed marriage. Elsie was the first to move. She knelt beside the hearth and reached for the fragments. Augusta ordered her to leave them. Elsie looked up. She did not raise her voice. She simply asked why. "Because wax cannot be mended," Augusta said. Tom had already crossed the room. He crouched and lifted the largest piece with both hands. He explained that sometimes a cylinder could be supported long enough to recover a portion of its sound, but Augusta told him he had caused enough harm for one evening. Charles gave a soft laugh that was meant to calm everyone. He said old performers often used false dedications because customers liked sentimental tricks. Ada turned toward him. She had heard that lullaby beside a riverbank, in a room with yellow curtains, and once beneath a blanket during a thunderstorm. She remembered her mother tapping 2 fingers against her back in time with the final notes. She remembered the name Little Sparrow, though no one had spoken it since. There had been no trick. Ada asked Tom where he had found the cylinder. Before he could answer, Augusta said it did not matter. Marian had sung in cheap halls and traveled with men who sold noise to fools. There could be 100 such cylinders. There could be lies on every one. Mrs. Pike's expression tightened at the mention of cheap halls. Augusta saw it. Shame passed over her face, then hardened into anger. She said Marian had disgraced the Vale name, deserted her child, and died in Chicago 2 winters before. Augusta had received notice and burned it. Ada felt as if the room had tilted. 2 winters. Her mother had been alive while Daniel was dying. Alive when Elsie finished school. Alive while Ada stood at the Vale house stove on winter mornings, believing there was no one left in the world who could answer her. She asked why Augusta had said nothing. Augusta replied that decent women did not drag refuse back into a clean house. Elsie stood so quickly that one of the wax fragments snapped beneath her shoe. Charles told her not to make a spectacle. It was the first time he had spoken to her as if the engagement already gave him authority. Elsie looked at him, then removed the pearl pin from its case and placed it beside his plate. She said only, "Then you should leave before I do." Mrs. Pike inhaled sharply. Mr. Pike's face reddened. Charles asked whether Elsie intended to throw away her future over the voice of a common singer. Ada expected Augusta to answer. Augusta always answered, but Augusta had gripped the back of her chair. Her knuckles were the color of flour. Tom gathered the cylinder fragments into the felt lining of his cap. He promised Ada that he would try to learn what remained on them. Then he lifted the phonograph and left through the same door by which he had entered. The Pikes followed through the front. No formal engagement was announced that night. By 10 o'clock, 3 women on Main Street already knew why. Augusta waited until the dining room had been cleared before she spoke again. The servants had been sent to the kitchen, though every one of them could hear through the swinging door. Elsie stood near the window with her arms folded. Ada remained beside the stain where the coffee had darkened the carpet. Augusta accused Elsie of humiliating a fine family and accused Ada of permitting it. Ada barely heard her. She kept seeing the cylinder fall. Her memories of Marian had never formed a whole face. There was dark hair pinned loosely at the neck, a warm shoulder beneath Ada's cheek, a laugh in the kitchen when flour drifted onto the floor. Then there was a night of rain, Augusta's black umbrella, and Marian's hand being pulled away. After that came rules. Ada was not to ask where her mother had gone. She was not to sing the river lullaby. She was not to keep the red ribbon Marian had tied around her braids. When Ada cried at night, Augusta told her that tears were wasted on women who could walk away from their own children. Over time, the rules became memory. At 14, Ada had repeated that her mother was selfish. At 16, she had believed it. When another girl whispered that Marian Vale had run with a traveling exhibition, Ada slapped her and then apologized to Augusta for losing control. At 17, she married Daniel in the parlor of the Vale house. Augusta stood beside her in plum-colored silk. There was an empty space in the second row of chairs, though Ada had told herself it belonged to no one. Now she knew Marian had still been alive. Ada asked where the death notice had come from. Augusta said Chicago. Ada asked who had sent it. Augusta said a charitable institution with an impertinent name she no longer remembered. Ada asked where Marian was buried. Augusta's mouth tightened. She did not know. "You burned the only notice?" "I protected you." It was Augusta's oldest answer. She had protected Ada from gossip, from coarse work, from unsuitable friends, from loud colors, from asking too much of Daniel, and from expecting to own any part of the Vale house. Every fence Augusta built was called protection, even when Ada was the one enclosed by it. Elsie asked whether protection required lying. Augusta turned on her. She said Elsie's behavior that evening proved what happened when young women were allowed too much freedom. Charles Pike could give her a house on Maple Avenue, servants of her own, and a name no one questioned. Elsie said she already had a name. Augusta answered that a woman's name was only as safe as the family willing to defend it. Ada saw then that the evening had opened more than one grave. Augusta intended to save Elsie exactly as she had saved Ada, by deciding which truth she could bear, which man she should marry, and which part of herself must be buried to deserve a place at the table. For once, Ada did not lower her eyes. She said there would be no engagement until Elsie chose it freely. Augusta seemed more startled by Ada's quiet words than by Elsie's rebellion. She reminded Ada that both mother and daughter lived under her roof. Ada replied that they also kept that roof standing. The sentence hung between them. Augusta's face changed. She had been contradicted before by tradesmen, by tax assessors, and once by a bishop's wife. She had never been contradicted by Ada in her own dining room. She told Ada to remember who had taken her in when Marian abandoned her. Ada said she was trying to remember. That night she did not sleep. Near midnight she walked through the hotel with a lamp, checking the front latch, the range, and the guest register as she had done every night for years. The house made its usual sounds. Pipes knocked in the walls. A boarder coughed on the second floor. Somewhere beyond the alley a horse stamped in its stall. Nothing had changed, and everything had. In the office, Augusta's desk stood beneath a portrait of the late Judge Vale, their father. He had died when Ada was 3. Marian had once told Ada that the judge could silence a room by clearing his throat. Augusta had inherited that power. Marian had inherited his dark eyes and none of his caution. Ada opened no drawers. She searched nothing. She only stood before the desk and imagined a piece of paper arriving from Chicago. Perhaps the envelope had been damp with snow. Perhaps Marian's name had been typed by someone who cared for dying women without families. Augusta had held it, read it, and placed it in the stove, the same stove in which Ada warmed her hands each morning. At dawn, Elsie found her in the kitchen shaping biscuit dough. Ada always worked when thought became unbearable. Elsie asked whether she regretted the broken engagement. Ada told her there had been no engagement to break. Elsie pressed her palms against the work table. She admitted that she had tried to want Charles because Augusta wanted him. Charles was polished, certain, and generous when others watched. But when Elsie spoke of studying bookkeeping at the business college, he called it a charming preparation for managing his household accounts. When she mentioned Tom's repair shop, Charles said men like Tom should be grateful for men like the Pikes, who lent them money. Ada asked whether Tom knew how she felt. Elsie said she did not yet know how she felt. She only knew she did not want Charles to tell her. Ada looked at her daughter's flour-dusted hands. At 17, Ada had mistaken the absence of cruelty for the presence of choice. She would not teach Elsie the same mistake. She told her daughter that uncertainty was not a sin. A false yes could do more harm than an honest delay. Then she promised they would go to Tom's shop as soon as breakfast was over. Tom Bader's shop occupied the narrow room between a cobbler and a dealer in farm tools. Its front window displayed alarm clocks, a sewing machine with its side plate removed, and a phonograph horn painted the blue of a summer sky. The sign above the door read, "Bader Repairs," though Tom's father still sat at the rear bench most mornings, bending over watches with a lens screwed into one eye. When Ada and Elsie arrived, Tom had laid the cylinder fragments on black felt beneath a magnifying glass. He looked as if he had not slept either. The damage was worse than he had hoped. The cylinder had broken through several grooves, and Augusta's heel had crushed one edge. He might recover brief passages by fixing the pieces around a supporting core and turning the machine by hand. He warned them that every attempt could destroy what remained. Ada asked him not to try yet. First, she wanted to know where it had come from. Tom brought out a shallow wooden rack holding 17 cylinders in individual paper sleeves. He had bought them with 2 machines from Tobias Greeley's nephew, who was clearing the old man's storeroom after his death. Most were ordinary: hymns, marching bands, comic recitations, and a speech by William Jennings Bryan copied so often that the grooves were nearly smooth. 4 sleeves carried a crescent drawn in purple ink. One was empty. Ada touched the mark. She remembered Marian cutting crescent moons from pie crust and placing them around the edge because Ada had once said a pie should have a night sky. The memory arrived complete: the warm kitchen, Marian's bent head, the smell of apples, and Augusta entering to say grown women should not waste food amusing a child. Tom explained that Tobias Greeley had traveled through Ohio, Indiana, and western Pennsylvania in the late 1880s with an exhibition phonograph. People paid a nickel to hear a recorded song through rubber listening tubes. For another coin, some could speak into the machine and preserve a message, though the soft wax wore quickly and recording was uncertain. Greeley later opened a music shop in Cincinnati. He closed it after the Panic of 1893 and stored much of his stock in Bellwether with a sister. Elsie asked if the remaining crescent cylinders could be played. Tom selected the least damaged one. He cleaned it with a brush so soft that Ada could barely see the bristles move. Then he placed it on the mandrel and fitted a reproducer whose stylus rested more lightly than the one used at the supper. Ada stood beside the blue horn. The machine turned. There was a hiss, then a woman singing without accompaniment. The voice was younger than the one Ada had heard in the dining room, stronger and less tired. It sang of a sparrow crossing winter fields with a red thread tied around its wing. Ada knew no such song. Yet she knew the way the singer held the last word of each line, allowing it to tremble before settling. Marian had done that while washing dishes. She had done it while combing Ada's hair. Near the end, the singing stopped. The woman laughed at someone beyond the recording horn. The sound struck Ada harder than the words had. She remembered that laugh. Not its exact music, but the feeling it made in a room, as if a window had opened. Then Marian spoke. She said the cylinder was the first one Tobias had allowed her to keep. If Ada ever heard it, she should know her mother had earned $2 that night and had put both into the red stocking for their river journey. The recording ended. Ada remained bent toward the horn. $2, a red stocking, a journey. None of those things fit the story Augusta had told. In Augusta's version, Marian left suddenly with a traveling showman because ordinary life bored her. She took no luggage except a carpet bag and left no money. She never asked to see Ada. But the woman on the cylinder had been saving for a journey with her child. Tom removed the cylinder and returned it to its sleeve. The next crescent recording began with several failed sounds and Tobias Greeley's distant instruction to stand nearer the horn. Marian then spoke Ada's full name, Ada Marian Vale, and said she had received a place with a demonstration company that would travel for 12 weeks. She would sing, manage tickets, and record customers' voices. By autumn, she expected to have enough to rent 2 rooms in Cincinnati and bring Ada to live with her. She said Augusta had promised to care for the child until then. Ada gripped the counter. Augusta had never mentioned a promise. The recording continued. Marian explained that the work was respectable, whatever people in Bellwether chose to call it. Mrs. Greeley traveled with the company. So did an elderly piano player and his wife. Marian would sleep in rooms approved by the women and send money every Friday. At the end, she addressed Augusta rather than Ada. She thanked her sister for giving the child a stable home for one summer. One summer. Ada had lived in the Vale house for 22 years. Elsie reached for her mother's hand. Tom's father had stopped working. He sat very still at the rear bench, the tiny lens lowered onto the table. The final marked cylinder in the rack was badly worn. Tom advised waiting until he could fit a finer stylus. Ada agreed. She asked whether anything else had come from Greeley's storeroom. Tom said there had been a canvas carrying case, a broken recording attachment, and a stack of printed handbills. Most had been ruined by mice. One surviving bill advertised Tobias Greeley's marvelous talking machine and Miss Marian Vale, the River Nightingale, appearing for 3 evenings at a hall in Richmond, Indiana, in June of 1886. Ada had been 13. At the bottom, beneath the ticket price, was a line stating that ladies and children could record a greeting during the afternoon exhibition. Tom turned the paper over. Someone had written a name on the back. Mrs. Celia Ward, Madison Street, Richmond. The ink was faded, but the address was clear. Ada did not know who Celia Ward was. Tom said they could find out. News of the broken supper reached the Methodist sewing circle before noon. By evening, the story had acquired a drunken performer, an illegitimate child, and a violent quarrel over money. None of these had occurred, but Bellwether had always valued improvement. Augusta reacted by ordering new white curtains for the front parlor and placing a notice in the newspaper that the Vale house would host the Ladies' Civic League reception the following Thursday. When respectability was threatened, she displayed more of it. She also informed Ada that Charles Pike was willing to overlook Elsie's outburst if the family offered a prompt apology. Ada asked whether Charles would apologize for speaking to Elsie as if she belonged to him. Augusta stared at her as though a chair had asked to vote. She reminded Ada that the Pikes controlled the mortgage on the Vale house. Ada had never been told there was a mortgage. Augusta dismissed the question. Every prudent business carried obligations. What mattered was that the Pikes could be allies, and Elsie had endangered that alliance over a mechanic's son and a dead woman's voice. Ada said the mechanic's son had behaved with more kindness than the banker's son. Augusta replied that kindness did not keep a roof over anyone's head. For the next 2 days, she spoke to Ada only through instructions. 4 rooms needed papering. The Civic League expected lemon ice. Mrs. Harlan in room 12 was not to receive meals upstairs unless the doctor confirmed illness. Augusta behaved as if enough routine could close the opening made by the cylinder. Ada performed every task, but in the evenings, after the boarders had gone upstairs, she and Elsie walked to Tom's shop. Tom repaired the broken cylinder with a patience that made the work look almost devotional. He shaped a thin support from plaster, fitted the largest pieces around it, and marked the damaged grooves. He could not restore the object. He could only help it turn once more. On the 3rd evening, the machine produced 6 intelligible passages. Marian's voice was older. She said Ada's name. She mentioned spring and the river. Then came a long, scarred section filled with knocks and scraping. After it, Marian said, "I came on your birthday." Another break swallowed several seconds, then, "She said you hid when you saw me." Ada closed her eyes. She had never hidden. The recording lurched forward. Marian's voice returned one last time, faint but distinct. "My sparrow, I will not pull at you until your wings tear." The stylus reached the broken edge and jumped free. No one spoke. Tom stopped the machine. Ada remembered her 14th birthday. Augusta had given her a white dress with pearl buttons and forbidden her to go outdoors. There had been a woman at the front door late in the afternoon. Ada had seen only a wet green sleeve through the crack before Augusta pushed her into the pantry and locked the door. For years, Ada had thought the memory belonged to a dream. She could still feel the pantry's cold tile beneath her bare feet. She could still hear someone on the other side of the house calling her name. Augusta had told Marian that Ada hid, and later, perhaps, she had told Ada that Marian never came. 2 lies facing one another across a door. Elsie wept without sound. Ada did not. Her grief had not yet found a shape it could leave through. Tom said Mrs. Celia Ward might know the rest. Richmond lay almost 90 miles away. The morning train left Bellwether at 6:10, changed in Dayton, and reached Richmond shortly after noon. Ada had not traveled alone since Daniel's death. She had never left the hotel for more than 2 nights in all her married life. She told Tom they would go on Sunday. Augusta could serve the boarders breakfast once. Augusta did not serve breakfast. She stood in the kitchen at 5 on Sunday morning wearing her gray traveling dress and informed Ada that Mrs. Tolliver, the cook's assistant, would manage. She had learned of the Richmond trip from the station agent's wife and considered it proof that Ada had lost all judgment. Ada continued wrapping biscuits in a cloth for the journey. Augusta said there was nothing in Richmond except old gossip and people willing to sell it. Marian had made her choices. Digging through them would not change the grave. Ada tied the cloth. She asked why Augusta had told Marian that her own child hid from her. For the first time, Augusta's certainty faltered. It lasted only a moment. She said Marian had arrived without warning, dressed like an actress, demanding to remove a 7-year-old child from the only secure home she knew. Ada had cried in the pantry. Augusta had interpreted the crying as fear. Ada remembered calling for her mother until her throat hurt. Augusta insisted memory was unreliable. Ada replied that a locked door was not. At 6, she and Elsie walked to the station. Tom waited on the platform with 3 tickets. He had closed his shop for the day, he said, because the address might have changed, and 2 women should not wander through an unfamiliar city alone. Elsie did not object. The train carried them south through fields silvered with dew. Telegraph poles passed in steady measure. Farmhouses appeared and vanished. At Dayton, they changed beneath an iron and glass roof filled with steam, porter's calls, and the clatter of milk cans. Ada had expected the journey to feel dramatic. Instead, it felt oddly domestic. Elsie peeled an apple with a pocket knife. Tom unfolded the timetable 3 times. A baby cried in the seat behind them. Ada watched laundry move in the yards beyond the tracks. She thought of Marian traveling with the Greeley Company. 12 weeks of stations, rented halls, boarding rooms, and strangers asking to hear their own voices return to them. Marian had been 30. She had left a child with a sister who promised 1 summer of safety. Ada tried to imagine herself doing the same. At 28, she had been nursing Elsie through measles while Daniel slept in the front room, and Augusta knocked at the door to say the hotel accounts required attention. Ada had gone because Augusta needed her. She had left Elsie for 3 hours and felt the distance like a physical chord. Marian had traveled for 12 weeks because she believed those weeks would buy a home. How many nights had she lain awake wondering whether Augusta had buttoned Ada's nightdress properly, whether the child had eaten, whether anyone had remembered the river song. Richmond was larger and smokier than Bellwether, with brick factories, streetcars, and broad streets lined by elms. Madison Street ran beyond the business district. Number 214 had become a funeral establishment. The undertaker, after hearing Celia Ward's name, directed them to a smaller house near the fairgrounds where her widowed daughter lived. Mrs. Ward was 81 and nearly blind. She sat by an open window with a crocheted blanket over her knees, though the day was warm. Her daughter introduced Ada, then had to repeat Marian's name close to the old woman's ear. Celia Ward lifted her head. "The girl with the river voice," she said. Those 6 words undid something in Ada. She sat down before her knees failed. Mrs. Ward had been Tobias Greeley's piano player. Her husband, Silas, handled tickets, crates, and electrical batteries. She remembered Marian not as a reckless woman, but as the only performer who could quiet a fairground crowd without shouting. Marian joined them in Cincinnati in the spring of 1886. She arrived wearing a brown dress mended under both arms and carrying a red wool stocking filled with coins. She had seen a newspaper advertisement for a lady singer and persuaded Mrs. Greeley to hear her. Tobias wanted comic songs. Marian offered ballads and lullabies. Audiences preferred her. She insisted that her name appear without the title Miss because she would not pretend to be unmarried. When a hall manager suggested otherwise, she refused to go on stage until the handbill was changed. Mrs. Ward smiled at the memory. Marian could be frightened and stubborn at the same time. Fear made some people smaller. It made Marian stand straighter. Every Friday she purchased a postal money order and sent it to Augusta for Ada's care. She kept the receipts inside the lining of her glove. Mrs. Ward knew because Marian counted the remaining coins at the same table where the company ate supper. Ada asked how long the tour lasted. 14 weeks, Mrs. Ward said. They added 2 towns after strong crowds in Indiana. At the end, Marian had enough for a deposit on 2 rooms above a German baker in Cincinnati. She bought a narrow bed for Ada and painted 3 yellow birds on the headboard. Then she returned to Bellwether. She came back to Cincinnati without the child. Mrs. Ward had been there when Marian stepped off the evening train. Her hat was gone. Mud covered her skirt. One side of her face was swollen. She carried no carpet bag, only one of Ada's red hair ribbons clenched in her hand. She would say very little. Augusta had obtained temporary guardianship while Marian traveled and refused to surrender Ada. Judge Vale's old friends had signed statements that Marian's work exposed the child to immoral influences. A physician who boarded at the Vale house declared her temperament unstable. Augusta offered a choice. Marian could leave quietly, or she could fight in county court and hear her own daughter described publicly as the child of a shameless entertainer. Marian intended to fight. She returned on Ada's 14th birthday with wages, references from respectable women, and a room ready. Augusta did not let her see the child. After that visit, Marian changed. She stopped speaking of the court as if justice were a door that would open when properly knocked upon. But she did not disappear. For 4 years, she sent money, clothes, and cylinders. Most parcels came back, some did not. She recorded on every machine Tobias let her use. Sometimes she spoke, sometimes she sang. Once she recorded nothing but the sound of rain because Ada had loved storms when held tightly. Mrs. Ward reached toward a small table. Her daughter placed an object in her hands. It was a child's ribbon, faded from red to rust. Marian had given it to Mrs. Ward in 1891 before leaving for Chicago. She said she had kept one half and Augusta had thrown the other into the mud during their quarrel. Mrs. Ward had saved it because someone should preserve proof that the child had once been held by both ends. Ada took the ribbon. The fabric was worn almost transparent where fingers had worried it. She could not know whether those fingers had been Marian's. Yet when she closed her hand around it, she remembered sitting between her mother's knees while the ribbon slid through her hair. The wax cylinder had opened the past. The ribbon made it touchable. Elsie asked why Marian went to Chicago. Mrs. Ward's face clouded. The Greeley Company failed during a fire at a Muncie Hall in 1890. No one died, but Marian inhaled smoke while leading 2 children down a rear stair. Her singing voice never fully recovered. Tobias kept her as a ticket seller until the company folded. In Chicago, a former performer found her work at Hull House, where she helped immigrant women write to relatives, find lodgings, and deal with factory foremen. She became useful in quieter ways. For years, she still returned to Bellwether. Mrs. Ward knew of visits in 1887, 1888, and 1890. On the last, Marian watched from across the street as Ada left church beside a young man. That young man must have been Daniel. Marian decided then that another public claim might injure Ada more than it helped her. She had heard Augusta was arranging a good marriage. The old accusations could ruin it. She told Mrs. Ward that a mother sometimes had to choose between being known and seeing her child safe. Ada bowed her head. Daniel had courted her in 1890. Augusta had worried endlessly about his parents discovering Marian's history. Ada had interpreted that worry as care. Marian, somewhere across the street, had interpreted the same fear as a danger she must not awaken. Both women had helped build Ada's marriage without asking whether it was the life she wanted. Mrs. Ward said Marian continued recording cylinders in Chicago whenever she could afford blanks. She sent them to Bellwether but never knew if Ada heard them. In later years, when commercial records grew harder and louder and everyone wanted famous songs, Marian's private little cylinders seemed like relics from another world. Tobias Greeley kept several at Marian's request. He promised that if Ada ever came looking, he would recognize the crescent mark. He died before she came. Ada asked about Marian's death. Mrs. Ward's daughter answered. Marian had worked at a residence for young factory women called the Lake Street Home. She fell ill during the winter of 1906 and died in February 1907. Pneumonia, they believed. The institution wrote to Augusta because Marian's small effects named Ada as next of kin. Augusta never replied. The Lake Street Home buried Marian in a cemetery outside Chicago beneath a plain stone paid for by the women she had helped. Her stone carried her full name. Not Miss Vale, not the River Nightingale. Marian Vale, mother. Ada covered her mouth. All her life, Augusta had said motherhood was proved by staying. Marian had been kept away, threatened away, and finally shamed into watching from a distance. Still, the women who buried her knew the word she had chosen for herself. Mrs. Ward leaned forward. Her clouded eyes could not find Ada's face, so Ada took both of her hands. The old woman said Marian had made mistakes. She had trusted a promise she should have secured. She had believed wages and a clean room could outweigh a judge's friends. Pride had kept her from begging once she understood Augusta enjoyed the begging. But she had not abandoned her child. Do not turn her into a saint, Mrs. Ward said. Just do not let them leave her a sinner. It was the longest direct sentence anyone spoke that day. Ada promised. Before they left, Mrs. Ward gave her the ribbon and a small brass cutting tool used to mark the opening edge of wax cylinders. Its curved tip made a crescent. Marian had borrowed it from Tobias for so long that he finally called it hers. Ada held the tool in one palm and the ribbon in the other. One had marked a voice meant to survive. The other had once tied a child to home. On the return train, Elsie slept with her head against the window. Tom sat across from Ada, watching farms darken beyond the glass. Ada told him there was something she did not understand. If Marian had sent money for 4 years, why had Augusta always spoken of the burden of raising her? Why had Ada begun work in the hotel kitchen at 9, been removed from school at 14, and been told the household could not afford another mouth unless she earned her place? Tom did not answer quickly. He said perhaps Augusta had used the money for the hotel. The possibility had already formed in Ada's mind. Hearing it aloud made it heavier. The Vale house nearly failed after the natural gas boom faded. Ada remembered winters when only 2 rooms were occupied, and Augusta dismissed every servant but the cook. Then, unexpectedly, the house received new wallpaper, better stoves, and repairs to the roof. Augusta claimed a distant cousin had repaid a debt. That was in 1890. The last year Marian regularly sent money. Ada looked down at the crescent tool. Augusta might have taken Marian's earnings while telling Ada that her mother gave nothing. That truth, if true, would be easy to expose with receipts or bank records. But Ada felt no hunger for columns of figures. The wound was not money. It was the childhood she had spent believing she had cost Augusta everything and meant nothing to Marian. No sum could measure that. Tom said the remaining cylinder might offer more. He had ordered a gentler reproducer from Dayton, and it should arrive within days. Ada thanked him. He shook his head. He had done little, he said. Ada disagreed. Many people could repair a machine. Few knew when to stop it from doing further harm. Tom glanced at Elsie, still sleeping. He said knowing when to stop was a skill he had learned late. Ada understood that he would not press Elsie for an answer simply because Charles Pike had been refused. Her respect for him deepened. They reached Bellwether after 9. Augusta waited in the hotel office. A single lamp burned on her desk. Beside it lay 2 newspapers, the room keys, and an envelope stamped with the Pike Bank seal. She did not ask what they had learned. She said the mortgage would be reviewed at the end of the month. Mr. Pike had written that recent disturbances raised doubts about the hotel's management. Unless the outstanding balance was reduced, the bank might require new terms or immediate settlement. Ada read the notice. The amount owed was greater than the Vale house earned in a year. Augusta explained that improvements cost money. The tiled entrance, plumbing, lace curtains, and electric fixtures had been necessary to attract a better class of guest. She had borrowed gradually. The Pikes had always been patient because Charles admired Elsie. The price of that patience now stood plainly before them. Elsie said she would not marry a mortgage. Augusta slapped her. The sound was not loud. That made it worse. Ada stepped between them. For one suspended second, aunt and niece faced one another. Augusta's hand remained raised. Ada saw age in it, the swollen joints, the tremor at the thumb, the skin thin as paper. Augusta was 64. She had held the family together through widowhood, debt, and scandal. She had also just struck Ada's child because a banker had put a number on obedience. Ada said Augusta would never do that again. Augusta lowered her hand. She accused Ada of filling Elsie's mind with ingratitude. Ada almost laughed. Ingratitude was the name Augusta gave every debt she could not collect. Instead, Ada placed the Pike notice on the desk and asked one question. Did Marian's money save this house? Augusta's eyes moved to the crescent tool in Ada's hand. She recognized it. That was answer enough. Ada told Elsie to go upstairs. After the girl left, Augusta sat behind the desk. The room seemed to rearrange itself around her, returning power to its familiar place. She said Marian's payments had been intended for Ada's care. The hotel provided that care. Coal, food, clothing, physicians, and school books were not free. Ada reminded her that she had worked in the hotel from childhood. Augusta said work had formed her character. Ada asked about the returned parcels, the birthday visit, and the temporary guardianship that somehow became permanent. Augusta's voice sharpened. Marian had been unfit. Traveling exhibitions attracted gamblers, drummers, drunkards, and men who believed a woman on a platform belonged to the room. Marian placed vanity above safety. She expected one summer of wages to make her independent, as if the world rewarded courage merely because it was sincere. Ada said Marian had a home ready. 2 rented rooms above a bakery. They were meant for us. They were meant to prove a point. There it was, the old battle still alive after Marian's death. To Augusta, every hope Marian held had been an accusation. Every song called Augusta dull. Every risk called her cowardly. She had not only feared for Ada, she had needed Marian to fail. Ada asked why she had said the child hid on her birthday. Augusta looked toward the window. She admitted that Marian's arrival had frightened her. If Ada left, Augusta would be alone in a failing house. The judge was dead, her husband was dead, and every room she opened reminded her that respectable people could still be poor. Ada was useful, affectionate, and young enough to love whoever fed her. Augusta had heard Ada crying in the pantry. She told herself the child feared Marian. Later, when she knew it was not true, she kept saying it because the lie had already purchased what she needed. Ada stood very still. Augusta had taken her not only to save her, but to save the Vale house. The hotel's polished floors, white curtains, and respectable table had been built partly from Marian's wages and partly from Ada's childhood. Yet Augusta did not apologize. She said survival left little room for clean choices. Marian could afford nobility because other women dealt with the consequences. Ada answered that Marian had paid for those consequences every Friday. Augusta flinched. Ada saw it and knew the argument had reached the place beneath words. She did not demand repentance. Repentance forced from a corner was only another performance. She asked where Marian's remaining things were. Augusta claimed there were none. Ada placed the crescent tool on the desk. Then look at me and say it. Augusta looked at the tool instead. Finally, she said there might be a valise in the attic. She had never opened it. Ada knew that was another lie, but at least it had a door. They climbed the narrow back stairs together. The attic of the Vale house held 30 years of things Augusta considered too valuable to discard and too disreputable to display. There were cracked wash basins, trunks from dead boarders, a child's iron bed, framed prints darkened by coal smoke, and chairs waiting for repairs no one intended to make. Rain tapped the roof. Ada carried a kerosene lamp because the electric wire did not reach above the third floor. Augusta led her past the linen chests to the far eave. The valise was green once, perhaps the same green as the sleeve Ada remembered at the front door. Now it was brown with dust. One brass clasp was missing. A strip of cloth had been tied around it. Ada recognized the cloth immediately. It was the other half of the red ribbon. She held the piece Mrs. Ward had given her beside it. The torn edges met. Augusta sat down on an overturned chair. Ada untied the ribbon. Inside the valise lay a pair of worn boots, a folded brown dress, a packet of handbills, 2 empty cylinder sleeves, and a child's wooden headboard painted with 3 yellow birds. Marian had prepared a bed for her. The headboard had been removed from its frame to fit inside the case. The paint was uneven. One bird had only a single wing because the yellow had run out. Ada knelt and touched the smallest bird. She had spent 22 years in a room chosen by Augusta, beneath a print of stern white lilies. All that time, this other room had survived in pieces above her head. There was no jewelry, no diary, no final confession. Only ordinary evidence of an intended life. Boots worn through at the heel, a dress carefully mended, advertisements for work already done, and a headboard painted by a mother who expected her child to sleep beneath it. In a side pocket, Ada found a cloth cylinder sleeve marked with a crescent. It was empty. Augusta said the cylinder had broken long ago. Ada asked whether she had broken it. Augusta did not answer. Then someone moved behind the attic door. It was Maggie Tolliver, the hotel cook, carrying a flat parcel wrapped in newspaper. Maggie had worked at the Vale house since Ada was 11. She was broad-shouldered, red-haired, and usually incapable of entering a room quietly. Now she looked ashamed. She told Augusta that silence had lasted long enough. Augusta ordered her downstairs. Maggie came farther into the attic. In 1890, after Marian's final visit, Augusta had given Maggie 3 cylinders and told her to put them in the ash bin. Maggie had obeyed with 2. The third had Marian's crescent on the rim. She could not bring herself to destroy it. She hid it inside the unused speaking tube that once ran from the attic to the kitchen. Years later, when the tube was removed, she wrapped the cylinder and kept it above the pantry ceiling. She had never heard it. The Vale house owned no phonograph, and fear had grown around the object until secrecy felt like loyalty. At the engagement supper, Maggie heard Marian's voice through the kitchen door. Since then, she had slept even less than Ada. She handed over the parcel. Ada felt the cylinder's shape through the newspaper. Augusta said Maggie was dismissed. Maggie answered that she would leave when Ada no longer needed breakfast cooked. Then she turned to Ada and admitted something else. Marian had not come only on the 14th birthday. She came 4 times while Maggie worked there. Once, Augusta sent her away from the front steps. Once, she waited in the rain across from the hotel until midnight. Once, she entered through the kitchen and stood within 10 feet of Ada, who was asleep with fever in the little room beside the pantry. Augusta had allowed Marian to sit beside the bed for 1 hour on the condition that she not wake the child. Maggie watched her hold Ada's hand. In the morning, Augusta told Ada that Maggie had sat with her. Ada remembered waking with a red ribbon tied loosely around her wrist. Augusta had removed it before breakfast. The attic blurred. Ada had spent years trying to explain why one memory felt warmer than all the facts she had been given. Now Maggie returned the missing hour. Marian had been there. Not often enough. Not bravely enough, perhaps. Not in the way a child deserved. But she had crossed the distance Augusta built, sat beside the bed, and held on without waking her. Ada pressed the wrapped cylinder against her chest. Augusta called Maggie's story sentimental treachery. Maggie looked at the woman who had employed her for 17 years and said she would accept any name except coward. Ada gathered the valise, the headboard, and the cylinder. At the attic stairs, Augusta asked what she intended to do. Ada said she intended to listen. Tom's new reproducer arrived on Tuesday. It came in a wooden crate packed with straw, along with a note from the Dayton supplier warning that old home recordings could be faint, uneven, or impossible to recover. Tom installed the part after closing his shop. Ada, Elsie, and Maggie waited beside the workbench. The rescued cylinder was darker than the others. Its surface bore scratches from years inside the speaking tube, but there were no cracks. A crescent marked the rim. Tom cleaned it twice. Before he placed it on the machine, he asked whether Ada wanted to listen alone. She looked at Elsie. All her life, family truth had been divided into private portions. One woman knew a visit, another knew a payment, a third knew a lie. Each kept her peace until the whole story became impossible to see. Ada said no. They would listen together. The cylinder began with heavy surface noise. For several turns, nothing emerged except a pulse like distant wheels over a bridge. Then Marian spoke. Her damaged voice was low and rough. She recorded the message in November 1890, 2 days after watching Ada leave church with Daniel. She said she had come to Bellwether to make one last claim. For 10 years, she had believed courage meant refusing to release what was hers. She had saved wages, gathered references, petitioned the court, and returned to doors that opened only far enough to wound her. Each effort gave Augusta a new reason to tell Ada that her mother was unstable. Now Ada was 17 and nearly a woman. Marian had seen her laughing on the church steps. She had also seen Augusta notice her across the street and move closer to Ada, as though shielding the girl from fire. Marian understood then that another court petition would not restore a childhood. It would force Ada to defend one of 2 women before a town eager to punish them both. So she would stop asking the town for permission to love her daughter. She would return to Chicago. She would continue sending a Christmas parcel each year, though Augusta might burn it. She would keep a room ready in whatever home she had. If Ada came at 18, 28, or 68, she would be received without a question designed to make her prove loyalty. Then Marian addressed Augusta. She did not accuse her of theft. She did not list the money or the returned gifts. She said something harder. She said Augusta had once been a frightened young widow who saved a failing house through discipline. Somewhere along the way, she began calling every living thing dangerous unless it stood where she placed it. Marian forgave the first frightened decision. She did not forgive the years of decisions that followed. The cylinder turned through a long pause. Ada could hear Marian breathing. Then came the words that survived most clearly. Ada, I was not absent because you were not worth staying for. I was absent because every road to you was made into a weapon against you. The voice weakened near the end. Marian said she had learned to help women whose families called survival a disgrace. She hoped that work would make some use of the years she could not give her own child. Her final wish was not that Ada forgive her. It was that Ada refused to inherit her silence. The cylinder ended with the river lullaby, sung in a voice that could no longer hold the high notes. Marian lowered the melody rather than abandon it. When the machine stopped, Maggie was crying openly. Elsie stood with one fist pressed beneath her chin. Tom turned away and busied himself with a screwdriver that required no attention. Ada felt no revelation bright enough to repair 22 years. She felt anger. She was angry with Augusta for closing the door, angry with Marian for accepting that the door could define the rest of their lives, angry with Daniel for never asking why his wife woke from certain dreams calling a name he pretended not to hear. angry with herself for becoming so skilled at not asking. Beneath the anger lay grief, and beneath the grief something quieter. Marian had known she might not be forgiven. She had spoken anyway. Ada asked Tom to play the cylinder again. The second time she noticed details. A streetcar bell sounded faintly in the background. Marian coughed before the lullaby. At one point, another woman whispered that the wax was running short. The recording had been made in a busy room, not a lonely chamber prepared for tragedy. Life had continued around Marian while she spoke. That mattered. The dead were often flattened into a single act, left, failed, sinned, suffered. But Marian had ridden streetcars, eaten meals, mended cuffs, laughed with women at work, and sometimes become impatient. She had lived nearly 17 more years after the recording. She was more than the mother kept from a door. Ada wanted to know that woman too. She decided to go to Chicago. First, however, she had to survive Thursday. The Ladies' Civic League arrived at the Vale house beneath a sky the color of pewter. 23 women entered the parlor wearing high collars, elaborate hats, and expressions of public purpose. They had come to discuss a drinking fountain for the courthouse square, but by then the true subject of the meeting was Ada's family. Augusta arranged the chairs in a semicircle. White lilies stood on the piano. The new curtains had arrived and were hung despite the mortgage notice. Ada prepared lemon ice, seed cakes, and coffee. She could have refused. She could have remained upstairs with Marian's valise. But the Vale House staff depended on the week's receipts, and Ada had not yet decided how to leave without pulling others into the fall. She wore a plain navy dress and Marian's faded ribbon around her wrist beneath the cuff. Elsie offered to help serve. Augusta ordered her to stay away from the meeting, saying the sight of her might embarrass Mrs. Pike. Elsie entered the parlor anyway and took a chair near the back. Charles arrived with his mother. Men did not usually attend Civic League meetings, but Charles carried a portfolio of architectural drawings for the proposed fountain. He greeted Augusta with grave courtesy and ignored Ada. The meeting began. For 40 minutes, the women debated whether the fountain should include a trough for horses and whether the word temperance should be carved on the base. Augusta chaired with perfect control. No one would have guessed that her hotel stood beneath a bank's threat. Then Mrs. Pike rose to discuss moral fitness. She said public improvements required private standards. Recent events had reminded her that young women from uncertain backgrounds could be misled by modern entertainments, unsuitable companions, and inherited instability. No name was mentioned. Every face turned toward Elsie. Ada felt the old mechanism close around her daughter. The polite language, the lowered voices, the accusation made respectable by being indirect. It was how Augusta had taken a child without calling it theft. It was how Marian had been erased without anyone admitting they had lied. Mrs. Pike continued. Her family remained compassionate, she said. Charles was prepared to overlook youthful confusion if Elsie publicly affirmed that malicious stories about her grandmother were false and ended her association with Tom Bader. Charles looked at Elsie with an expression intended to resemble mercy. Elsie's face was pale. Ada placed the coffee pot on the serving table. Augusta gave her a warning glance. Ada ignored it. She walked into the center of the semicircle and said that before Elsie affirmed anything, the room should hear the story Mrs. Pike wished her to deny. Murmurs moved among the chairs. Augusta called for a recess. Ada continued. She said Marian Vale had been a paid singer and demonstrator of a new machine. She traveled under the supervision of married women, sent wages home for her child, and returned with a room prepared for them both. She was denied entry by a guardian who needed the child's money and labor. Augusta stood. Ada did not name her. She did not need to. Mrs. Pike said private accusations did not belong in a civic meeting. Ada replied that neither did a young woman's marriage, yet Mrs. Pike had placed it on the agenda. Someone near the window hid a smile. Ada took the crescent tool from her pocket. She explained what it was and how Marian used it to mark recordings for a daughter who was not allowed to receive them. Charles asked whether the room was expected to trust the performance of a dead actress over the word of a respected living woman. Tom entered through the open parlor door. He had not come uninvited. Elsie had asked him to bring the phonograph. The blue horn rose above his shoulder. Augusta ordered him out. Ada said he would stay. It was the first command she had given in the Vale house without considering whether Augusta might reverse it. Tom placed the machine on a side table. He had brought the oldest undamaged cylinder, the one on which Marian spoke of one summer, wages, and a home in Cincinnati. Ada chose it because it contained no accusation. It carried only Marian's intention in her own voice. The women listened. Some leaned forward, some stared at their gloves. Mrs. Pike's mouth hardened when Marian described Mrs. Greeley and the married piano player. Those respectable witnesses ruined the easiest part of the scandal. When the cylinder ended, Ada did not play the final recording. That voice belonged first to her and Elsie. She would not turn Marian's pain into an exhibition merely because an exhibition might win. Instead, Ada said her mother had made errors. She left a child in the care of a sister without understanding what fear and money could do. Later, she stayed away too long. But she did not abandon Ada for pleasure, and she did not forget her. That was the false story Elsie was being asked to affirm. Elsie rose. She said she would not begin a marriage by repeating a lie that had already ruled 3 women. Charles closed his portfolio. He told her she would regret choosing a repairman's gossip over the security his family offered. Elsie answered that security purchased with silence was only a quieter form of danger. Ada had not taught her those words. Perhaps no mother could choose the exact truth her child carried forward. She could only stop choosing the lies. Mrs. Pike left first. Charles followed, then 3 women who depended on the Pike Bank for loans. Others remained. The president of the Civic League, a hardware merchant's widow named Mrs. Bell, asked whether the coffee would still be served. Ada said it would. The meeting resumed without the Pikes. They voted for a fountain with a horse trough and no carved word. By evening, every household in Bellwether knew that Ada Whitaker had defended a traveling singer before the Civic League and that Augusta Vale had been unable to stop her. The story was repeated with errors, of course, but for the first time, the central error did not belong to Augusta. The bank's formal demand arrived the next morning. The Vale house had 30 days to pay half the outstanding mortgage or submit to foreclosure. Augusta blamed Ada. She said the Pikes might have extended the debt for years if Elsie had married Charles. Ada had destroyed the hotel for the sake of a woman who never managed to build a home of her own. Ada looked around the office. The keys, accounts, menus, linen schedules, repair lists, and staff wages all passed through her hands. Augusta had believed ownership meant the building could not imagine another center. She was wrong. Ada asked to see the mortgage papers and the hotel's true obligations. Augusta refused. Ada said then she could no longer manage a business whose condition was hidden from her. Augusta laughed once, sharply. Where would Ada go? Daniel had left little insurance. The house in which they had lived was rented after his death. Elsie had no husband. Marian had left them a valise of rubbish and a voice no one could eat. Ada said she would find rooms. Augusta reminded her that Bellwether already called her family unstable. Ada answered that Bellwether had always spoken. At least now it would have to keep pace with the truth. She removed the ring of hotel keys from her belt and placed it on the desk. The sound they made was smaller than the breaking cylinder. It frightened Augusta more. Ada gave 2 weeks' notice, not because Augusta deserved it, but because the guests and staff did not deserve sudden confusion. She would prepare inventories, menus, and instructions. After that, she and Elsie would leave. Maggie announced that she would leave with them. So did Ruth Tolliver, Maggie's niece, who scrubbed the upstairs rooms. The laundress said she preferred to wait until wages were discussed, which Ada considered sensible. Augusta accused Ada of stealing her servants. Ada said no one in the house was a chair. For the next 14 days, mother and daughter packed after midnight. Their possessions were modest. Daniel's books filled 1 crate. Elsie owned school papers, 3 dresses, and a collection of pressed leaves. Ada packed kitchen knives she had bought with her own wages, 2 quilts, photographs of Daniel and Elsie, Marian's valise, the Yellowbird headboard, and the repaired cylinder in its padded sleeve. Tom found them 5 rooms above a closed confectioner's shop on Market Street. The owner, Mrs. Bell of the Civic League, needed tenants and admired women who served coffee after public scandal. The rooms had been empty for a year. Dust furred the window ledges. The wallpaper peeled in the hall. The former shop below still contained a marble counter, copper pans, and a soda fountain that no longer worked. Ada saw possibility before she saw dirt. Bellwether had 2 saloons, 3 restaurants, and no respectable place where women working in shops could eat a warm midday meal without ordering through a hotel. Ada proposed opening a lunchroom below and renting 2 upstairs rooms to women clerks. Mrs. Bell offered 6 months at a reduced rent if Ada repaired the kitchen stove. Tom could repair the stove. Elsie could keep accounts. Maggie could cook enough soup to convert enemies. Ada had $37 in savings. It was not security, it was a beginning. On their final morning at the Vale house, Augusta did not come downstairs. Ada supervised breakfast, showed the new cook where the preserves were kept, and corrected the linen count. At 10, she carried the last valise into the office. Augusta sat at the desk, surrounded by papers she had refused to share. Without Ada, she looked smaller than the chair. She asked whether Ada expected an apology. Ada considered the question. She wanted Augusta to say she had been afraid. She wanted her to admit that love had become ownership and protection had become hunger. She wanted one sentence large enough to return a mother, a childhood, and 22 years. No such sentence existed. Ada said she expected nothing that had to be dragged from behind a locked door. Augusta's eyes filled, though no tear fell. She said Marian always made goodness look easy because she left other people to perform the hard parts. Ada replied that Marian's goodness had not been easy. It had simply been hidden where Augusta did not have to see it. She lifted the valise. At the office door, Augusta asked whether Ada would play the final cylinder for the town. Ada said no. Some truths needed witnesses. Others needed family. Then she left the Vale house by the front entrance. It was the first time she had crossed its threshold carrying everything that belonged to her. The Market Street lunchroom opened on the first Monday in September. They called it the Sparrow Table. Ada hesitated over the name. She did not want her new life to become a memorial built entirely around the old one. But Elsie pointed out that sparrows were ordinary, stubborn birds. They lived beneath eaves, stole crumbs from railroad platforms, and returned after hard winters without asking whether anyone considered them elegant. Ada painted the sign herself. The first day brought 6 customers. 3 came from curiosity after the Civic League story. 1 came because Maggie's beef soup could be smelled halfway down the block. 2 were salesgirls from the dry goods store who had 10 cents each and only 20 minutes for dinner. Ada served all 6. By the end of the week, they had 21 regular customers. Tom repaired the soda fountain and refused payment until Ada threatened to hire someone less stubborn. Elsie kept the receipts in a simple cash drawer and posted prices where everyone could see them. No customer owed affection in exchange for soup. The rooms upstairs filled as well. One tenant was a telephone operator whose parents lived on a farm. The other taught the colored school on the edge of town and had been refused a room at 2 boarding houses. Ada rented to her without consulting the neighbors. Some customers stopped coming. Others began. Ada learned that dignity could cost money and still be worth purchasing. The Vale house struggled. Augusta hired a new manager, dismissed him after 9 days, then hired a cousin from Dayton who ordered expensive fish no one ate. 2 traveling salesmen moved to the Sparrow Table's upstairs rooms. The cook burned breakfast. The Civic League transferred its winter luncheon to Mrs. Bell's house. Ada took no pleasure in the decline. The hotel had been her labor too. Every empty room felt like watching a field she had planted go dry because the owner refused water. She sent Augusta a written offer, not a personal letter, but a clear business proposal dictated to a local typist. Ada would return as paid manager with full access to the mortgage terms and authority over daily operations. Elsie's marriage would remain outside any negotiation. Past wages would not be claimed. Future wages would be written and witnessed. Augusta returned the proposal unopened. 2 weeks later, the Pike Bank posted notice of foreclosure. That evening, Augusta came to the Sparrow Table after closing. She wore the black coat reserved for funerals. Ada was rolling pie dough. Elsie and Tom were replacing a shelf in the front room. Maggie had gone upstairs. Augusta looked around at the scrubbed counter, the jars of pickles, the repaired fountain, and the little tables covered with checked cloths. She noticed the yellow bird headboard mounted on the wall behind the counter. Ada had decided not to use it on a bed. It belonged where daily life could see it. Augusta said the bank would take possession in 10 days. Ada washed flour from her hands. She asked whether Augusta had come to accept the proposal. Augusta had not. She had come to ask Elsie to speak with Charles. Even then, facing the loss of the house, Augusta still reached for the nearest young woman's future. Elsie set down the shelf. She said she would speak with Charles if Augusta first answered one question. If the bank forgave the debt, would Augusta expect the next daughter in the family to marry for every repair the roof required? Augusta called the question cruel. Elsie said so was the bargain. Ada watched Augusta absorb the refusal. The old woman seemed less angry than bewildered. Control had been her only language for so long that unpurchased love sounded like silence. Ada repeated the management offer. She added that if the bank would not extend the loan, she would help arrange a sale before foreclosure so Augusta might retain something. Augusta asked why Ada would help after everything. Ada said help was not surrender. She would not let Augusta define her kindness as obedience anymore. Augusta looked toward the phonograph on the sideboard. Tom had found an inexpensive cabinet model, and customers sometimes paid a penny to hear a song after supper. Marian's cylinders were kept upstairs, never mixed with the public ones. Augusta asked to hear the final recording. Ada said not that night. Forgiveness was not a room Augusta could enter merely because she had finally knocked. The old woman left without accepting the proposal. But the next morning, her attorney brought the hotel papers. The truth of the Vale house was worse than Ada expected, and simpler than Augusta had made it sound. There were no mysterious investments, no single disaster, and no cousin's forgotten debt. Augusta had borrowed against the hotel whenever appearance demanded more than the rooms earned. A tiled floor when linoleum would have served. Lace curtains after a new hotel opened near the station. Electric fixtures installed before bellwether service was reliable. A private bathroom for the best suite because Mrs. Pike remarked that modern hotels had them. Each improvement defended the house's reputation while weakening the house itself. Marian's money had indeed saved it during the early 1890s. The postal orders appeared only as deposits, with no name attached, but the dates matched Mrs. Ward's memory. Augusta had spent almost none on Ada directly. She used the funds to repair the roof and pay overdue taxes. Ada read the papers in the law office with Augusta beside her. She felt anger, but not surprise. The figures could prove misuse. They could not explain the frightened widow who believed a polished entrance would prevent anyone from smelling poverty. They could not explain why Augusta preferred owing a banker to owing her younger sister gratitude. Ada negotiated with the Pikes herself. Mr. Pike received her in an office paneled with dark oak. Charles sat near the window, taking notes no one requested. They expected apology, urgency, and perhaps an offer involving Elsie. Ada gave them none. She presented 3 years of hotel occupancy from memory, then corrected herself when Charles challenged a winter figure. She described the waste under the new manager, the value of the property, and the likely loss the bank would suffer from an auction held before the Christmas travel season. She proposed that the bank suspend foreclosure for 90 days while the hotel operated under her authority and offered rooms to long-term commercial tenants at stable rates. Mr. Pike asked what security she could provide. Ada named her labor and the hotel's actual income. Charles smiled. He said labor was not collateral. Ada replied that his bank was about to learn how little collateral could do without labor. Mr. Pike looked at his son, then back at Ada. He granted 60 days. It was not generosity. It was business, which made the agreement safer. Ada did not move back to the Vale house. Each morning she walked from Market Street to the hotel, opened the office books, assigned rooms, inspected the kitchen, and left by 4 to prepare supper at the Sparrow table. Augusta retained the private rooms on the 3rd floor and the title Mrs. Vale. She no longer controlled wages, menus, or Elsie. The new arrangement offended them both in useful ways. Ada learned how often she had softened facts to spare Augusta. Augusta learned that authority written on paper could have limits. They spoke politely, rarely, and only about work. One afternoon, Ada found Augusta standing in room 17 with a clean pillowcase in her hands, unable to remember which end to turn inward. The sight would once have satisfied some hidden hunger for justice. Instead, it made Ada tired. She showed her. Augusta said Marian used to laugh at her because she could manage a court reception but not make a bed without trapping the sheet. It was the first ordinary memory of Marian she had offered. Ada asked what else had made Marian laugh. Augusta almost closed again. Then she said Marian laughed whenever the judge sneezed because he tried to make even a sneeze sound authoritative. She laughed at burnt biscuits, pompous men, and hymns sung too slowly. Once she placed a frog in Augusta's sewing basket and denied it for 12 years. Ada listened. These were not apologies. But they gave Marian a childhood, a sisterhood, and a life before the wound. For the next month, small memories appeared without warning. Augusta remembered that Marian hated pears but loved pear preserves. She remembered her dancing barefoot in the laundry yard during a summer storm. She remembered cutting Marian's hair after typhoid and saving one dark curl in a Bible, then losing it when she moved to the Vale house. Every memory made the cruelty stranger, not smaller. People often believed love prevented betrayal. Ada learned that love could sharpen betrayal when fear was given authority. At the end of 60 days, the hotel showed a modest profit. Mr. Pike extended the loan for a year at a fixed rate. The lace curtains were sold, 2 unused parlors became rented rooms. The white lilies disappeared from the piano. Augusta objected to all 3 changes and accepted the proceeds. Ada signed a contract as manager. Her wages went into an account at a different bank. Snow came early in December. On the first Sunday after it settled, Ada and Elsie boarded a train for Chicago. Tom remained in Bellwether to mind the lunchroom accounts with Maggie, an arrangement Maggie described as dangerous to both arithmetic and soup. He and Elsie had begun walking together after closing, but neither spoke of marriage. Ada was glad. Love deserved time before it was made responsible for a roof. Chicago seemed to Ada like 10 cities arguing in one place. Elevated trains thundered above the streets. Wagons crowded beside electric streetcars. Women in factory coats hurried past ladies stepping from carriages. Smoke pressed the sky low over buildings that appeared too tall to trust. The Lake Street home occupied a brick building west of the river. Its superintendent, Miss Florence Kemp, had known Marian for 9 years. She received Ada in a plain office warmed by a hissing radiator. On the wall hung a group photograph of 30 women standing beneath a banner that read, "Safe rooms, fair wages, no questions before supper." Marian stood in the second row. Ada recognized her at once. Not because the face matched memory. The woman in the photograph was older, thin around the mouth, and wore spectacles. Ada recognized the slight tilt of her head, the expression of listening even while being observed. Miss Kemp gave her a copy. She also gave her Marian's remaining possessions: a wool shawl, 2 library cards, a tin of buttons, the glove with the slit lining where money order receipts had once been kept, and a bundle of recipes copied for the home's kitchen. There were no treasures. There was a life. Miss Kemp said Marian had not spoken often about Bellwether. When she did, she blamed herself more than Augusta. She believed she had mistaken determination for preparation, and then mistaken sacrifice for wisdom. She never called Ada ungrateful. Each March, on Ada's birthday, Marian baked an apple pie with crescent moons around the edge. The residents knew not to ask for the first slice. Marian placed it on a plate by the window until evening. Then she carried it to the alley for whoever was hungry. Ada remembered the pie crust moons. She had believed the memory too small to matter. Miss Kemp led them through the sewing room, the kitchen, and the dormitory where Marian had worked. Women who came to the home were not required to explain whether a husband had abandoned them, a factory had dismissed them, or a family had closed its door. They ate first. Questions came later, if at all. Marian had insisted on that rule. She said hungry women were always made to confess before being given bread, and the bread never tasted free afterward. Elsie wrote this sentence in her notebook. At the cemetery, snow covered most of the grass. The stone was smaller than Ada imagined. Marian Vale's name was cut plainly above the word Mother. Beneath it, the women of the home had chosen a line. She kept a place. Ada cleared snow from the letters with her gloved hand. For years, she had pictured any meeting with Marian as an accusation. Why did you leave? Why did you stop? Why did you let me believe? At the grave, no answers arrived. Ada told her mother that she had heard the cylinders. She told her Elsie was 17, clever with numbers, and determined not to marry a mortgage. She described the sparrow table, the yellow birds, and the old woman in Richmond who still remembered the river voice. Then she said the thing that had taken the entire journey to form. She said she was angry Marian had stayed away. She also said anger was no longer the same as believing she had not been loved. The distinction did not forgive everything. It freed something. Elsie stood beside her until the cold reached their feet. Before they left, she placed no flowers. Winter would take them. She placed a handful of crumbs from the train biscuits on the top of the stone. Sparrows found them before Ada and Elsie reached the cemetery gate. Augusta came to the sparrow table on Christmas Eve carrying the phonograph cylinder she had broken. Tom had returned the fragments after determining that no more sound could be recovered. Augusta had asked him for them without telling Ada. Now they rested in a narrow wooden cradle lined with green cloth. The three main pieces had been fitted together, the wounds still visible. Augusta set the cradle on the counter. She said she had spent half her life believing broken things should be hidden because damage invited judgment. Tom had told her the cylinder could never play again, but that did not make it worthless. Ada waited. Augusta removed her gloves one finger at a time. She confessed that Marian had sent 12 cylinders directly to the Vale house. Augusta destroyed 9. Maggie saved 1. Tobias Greeley somehow kept the others. Augusta listened to only the first before breaking it. It contained Marian singing the lullaby and asking Ada to remember the river. Augusta feared that if Ada heard the voice, every careful fact she had constructed would collapse. So she destroyed the recording and told herself wax was fragile. The sentence cost her. Ada could see it. Augusta said she had loved Marian from the day their mother placed the baby in her arms. She had also envied her. Marian could enter a room poor and leave people feeling rich. Augusta could save a house and still make everyone inside it feel indebted. When Marian asked her to keep Ada for one summer, Augusta experienced a happiness she was ashamed to name. The house had a child again. Someone needed her without first comparing her to Marian. Then the money came. The first payment repaired the roof. The second kept the tax collector away. By the time Marian returned, Augusta had begun to see Ada's departure not as the end of a promise, but as the collapse of everything she had rescued. She used the court because she could. She used gossip because it was cheaper than law. And after each decision, she invented a kinder reason for the next. Augusta did not ask Ada to understand. She said understanding had protected her long enough. Then she apologized. Not for failing to be warm, not for making difficult choices, not for the times in which they lived. She apologized for telling a child she was unwanted when the truth was that 2 women wanted her and one refused to share. Ada gripped the counter. That was the wound's true name. Augusta had finally spoken it. Ada did not embrace her. She did not say everything was forgiven. Some apologies opened a door. They did not erase the rooms behind it. She asked whether Augusta wished to hear Marian's final cylinder. Augusta nodded. They went upstairs. Elsie placed the cylinder on the phonograph. Tom adjusted the reproducer. Maggie stood in the doorway with her apron still on. Augusta sat alone in the chair nearest a blue horn. Marian's roughened voice filled the room. When she said that Augusta called every living thing dangerous unless it stood where she placed it, the old woman closed her eyes. When she forgave the first frightened decision but not the years that followed, Augusta bent her head. The river lullaby came last. Augusta began singing under her breath. Ada had not known she knew it. The 2 sisters must have learned the melody before either of them became the woman Ada remembered. Perhaps their mother sang it. Perhaps they made it together. Augusta's voice had little beauty, but it found the notes Marian could no longer reach, and carried them to the end. When the cylinder stopped, Augusta remained seated. She said Marian had written the song at 14 after finding a fallen sparrow beneath the courthouse eaves. Augusta had helped make the red thread harness that held its injured wing. They kept the bird in a laundry basket until it flew. The little sparrow had belonged to both sisters before it belonged to Ada. Love, Ada thought, had not vanished from the family. It had been fought over until everyone mistook the wounds for proof that it was gone. She sat across from Augusta. They did not reconcile that night. They began. The Vale house survived. It became plainer and more profitable. Commercial travelers filled the new rooms. The best suite lost its private bath when the pipes froze, and no one died of the disgrace. Augusta continued to occupy the 3rd floor, though she surrendered the office desk to Ada. She never became easy. She corrected the angle of pictures at the sparrow table and complained that Maggie oversalted soup. She refused to call Tom anything but Mr. Bader for 3 years, which he considered progress. She and Ada still quarreled about money, curtains, and whether women traveling alone required moral supervision. But Augusta no longer used Marian's name as a warning. On Ada's birthday, she baked an apple pie. The crescent moons around the edge were clumsy. One burned black. Ada served every slice. Elsie attended the business college in Dayton for 1 term and returned with new methods, sharper pencils, and strong opinions about double-entry bookkeeping. She became a partner in the sparrow table, though she and Ada kept their accounts in ordinary books without treating them as instruments of family judgment. Tom waited. He and Elsie married in the spring of 1911 in the lunchroom after closing. There were no white roses, no pearl pin, and no bank bargain. Augusta wore plum silk left from Ada's wedding and sat beside Maggie. The phonograph played a waltz recorded by strangers. Marian's cylinders remained upstairs. A year later, Elsie gave birth to a daughter. She did not name the child Marian. She and Tom chose Ruth after Maggie's niece, who had become their closest friend. The choice surprised Augusta, who had expected some grand gesture of restoration. Ada understood. The dead did not need every living child to carry their names. They needed the living to carry the truth. When Ruth was 6 months old, Tom brought home a blank cylinder and a recording attachment. Home recording had become old-fashioned by then. Flat discs were replacing cylinders in shop windows. The new records played louder and lasted longer. Tom said the cylinder machine would soon belong to the past. Ada liked it for that reason. She placed the blank wax on the mandrel. Elsie held Ruth near the horn. Augusta sat by the window, older now, her back still straight. Ada had prepared no speech. She spoke her full name. Then she named Marian Vale, who sang for a living, made mistakes, lost a court fight, helped women in Chicago, and kept a place for her child until death. She named Augusta Vale, who saved a house, stole a childhood, told a terrible lie, and finally told the truth about it. She named Elsie, who refused to marry a debt. She named Ruth, who owed none of them a life shaped like repayment. Ada did not soften the story for the child. She did not sharpen it into revenge. She left the difficult parts beside the loving ones. Near the end, Ruth made a small, impatient sound. Everyone laughed. The laughter entered the wax. Ada finished by saying that families often believed silence protected the young. Usually, it protected the choices of the old. If Ruth ever heard the recording, she should ask questions while the people who knew the answers were still in the room. Tom lifted the stylus. The cylinder stopped turning. Augusta asked to add something. Tom fitted a second blank. For a moment, Augusta could not speak. The woman who had commanded dining rooms, lawyers, servants, bankers, and children seemed frightened by the narrow opening of the horn. Then she leaned toward it. She said Marian's laugh had sounded like a window opening. Ada closed her eyes. It was the same thought she had held in Tom's shop when she heard the first song. She had never told Augusta. Some memories, it seemed, could travel between people without becoming identical. They did not prove magic. They proved that two witnesses had once stood in the same light. Augusta continued. She said she had spent too many years closing windows because weather might enter. She hoped Ruth would learn the difference between shelter and a sealed room. That was all. Tom removed the cylinder and marked its sleeve with the date. Ada took Marian's brass cutting tool and pressed a crescent near the rim. Not because the recording belonged to sorrow, because it belonged to the family. Years later, people in Bellwether remembered the scandal at the Vale house in different ways. Some said a singer's ghost broke an engagement. Some said Ada Whitaker blackmailed the Pike Bank with secret records, though no such thing occurred. Others claimed the Sparrow Table began because Augusta threw Ada into the street, which gave Augusta more power than she had possessed. Ada stopped correcting every version. She corrected the one that mattered. Whenever someone said Marian Vale abandoned her child, Ada answered that Marian had been kept away, had then made the flawed choice to remain away, and had loved her daughter through both failure and distance. The whole truth took longer than the lie. Ada gave it the time. The broken cylinder remained in its green cradle on a shelf above the yellow birds. It never played again. Customers sometimes asked why she kept a useless thing. Ada would say it was not useless. It had carried one sentence far enough to change 4 lives. Then she returned to the stove, the accounts, the guests, or the child waiting in her arms. Her life did not become free of grief. It became free of the wrong grief. For 22 years, Ada had mourned a mother who chose not to love her. That woman had never existed. The real Marian was more difficult. Loving, proud, brave, frightened, persistent, and finally too willing to call absence a sacrifice. Ada could grieve her honestly. She could love her honestly, too. On certain evenings, after the Sparrow Table closed, Ada played the river lullaby on the least worn cylinder. The old wax hissed. Marian's young voice rose through the blue horn. Augusta, if she was present, never left the room. When the song ended, there was always a moment of silence. But it was no longer the silence of a locked pantry, a burned notice, or a child taught not to ask. It was the silence people keep after hearing something true. Then someone spoke.